although it's so much bigger than you are, in the way that playing an orchestra is so much bigger than you are, the position you have as a composer, from my point of view, it's critical, it's incredibly privileged, and it influences so heavily the way an audience understand a film.
Welcome to the Origins of Creativity podcast, brought to you by Bookling Media, where we discover the magic behind creativity through the stories of passionate creators. Listen in and fill your creative vessel with delightful insights and uplifting tales. Hello, you are listening to the Origins of Creativity podcast. I am your host, Becky Garish. I want to thank our listeners for joining us today. Today we'll be talking about what it takes to be a professional violinist and a film composer. Please be sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app. This way you won't miss the next episode, and it helps others find us. My guest is a professional violinist and film composer. Australian-born and based in London, our guest has led a multifaceted musical career across genres. One of Britain's foremost violinists and a former principal member of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, he has performed on the great stages of the world as guest concertmaster, soloist, and chamber musician. He is also a member of the Britain Academy of Film and Television Arts and has composed a string of feature film scores. He has led touring bands and orchestras for music icons, studio orchestras, and multiple film and television scores. I am excited to chat with today's guest, Patrick Savage. Welcome.
Becky, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I'm genuinely honored.
Of course. So let's jump in. Could you tell me about your album, The Golden Age of Hollywood, concert work for violin and piano?
So it's quite a long and convoluted title, but the problem is that the idea for the album was a little bit complex and hard to reduce into a title. Essentially, it's music by some of the greatest American composers in history, from one of the most exciting creative periods in history, which is the Golden Age of Hollywood. So that's the time from when talkies began until the ascendance of television. And Hollywood was a magnet for some of the greatest talent from around the world. That went for every facet of filmmaking, not just music, but it attracted some of the greatest music makers, players, composers. They came to America often. Well, it overlapped with times of war, times of great poverty. So there were people coming to America seeking a better life and drawn to Hollywood because it was just a beacon. It was such an exciting place. And they were churning out more films than ever before or ever since. And many of the greatest musical talents came to the US, often from Central Europe. They came to LA seeking their fortune. And they weren't film composers. I mean, these composers weren't film composers. Film was relatively new. I don't know how many people at that time actually called themselves film composers. They were composers who then sought work in film. I guess up until that point, they'd largely been known as classical composers. The problem was that once they took the Hollywood silver dollar, if you like, the classical world sort of looked down their noses at them a little bit. And it got quite difficult for many of these incredibly talented people to have their music taken seriously in the classical world after that. So the result of that is there's a lot of music out there by phenomenally talented people that goes to this day unplayed, sitting collecting dust, because those who made the judgments of who was serious and who wasn't serious at the time decreed that they weren't serious. The idea was to find some of the very special music, some of the works written by film composers but not for film. So classical music, and play it, record it often. And a lot of it is recorded for the first time for the reasons I've just described. Wonderful, wonderful music, ignored. And from some of the most famous people, I mean, many of them were household names in their day, and yet nobody played a lot of this music. So I just felt it was long overdue. And so I took the violin and piano pieces and recorded them. So that's what that album was.
That is amazing to think about, and that is true, when things are new that you're not gonna consider it, film or otherwise. You're just gonna think it as composing. So that's wild, and I mean, it's beautiful, and you're right to bring out the works that are ignored or put aside because of what's popular or what's, is amazing.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely. I mean, I think, I think in the classical music world, we like to consider ourselves to be above the influence of fashion and above base things like money and not, but absolutely not the case. Like any other human activity, it's very much influenced by what's fashionable, who's influential at the time, and unfortunately, at that time, it meant that a whole stack of music uh, was ignored because it just wasn't. It wasn't in fashion. Wasn't considered inverted commas serious enough. Yeah, so it was an attempt at a little bit of a revival, and I think to me it was quite personal because as a person who's worked in the ostensibly serious classical world and who now works largely in the film world, maybe in a way it was a statement to say, actually, I haven't sold out. I'm actually, I still care deeply about what I do. And yeah, I just feel I can relate to the composers involved, except they're much better composers than
Exactly.
I am. But because a lot of the music hadn't been played, I had to get permission from families often uh, to play some of those pieces. And so I kind of felt a certain responsibility that I didn't want this recording to just disappear into the ether. It was quite important that it sort of gets out there. So it was incredibly gratifying and a great relief that it did have sort of a really good critical reception. Because if it had just disappeared, I feel like
Mhm.
that would have been incredibly sad.
To have those, beautiful pieces not be played. Yeah, it's a loss for culture and music, and that's really great that you were able to, you know, talk to them and get that approval and reception for the music, which made me wonder how being a professional, being paid for your work affects creativity. And I can see it maybe being positive in both ways and also maybe negative some ways. What do you think?
It's a really interesting question. How important it is for your passion to be your livelihood, because it cuts both ways. I'm delighted that it's my livelihood. And I'm delighted that actually music is my livelihood, not just playing the violin, because actually I think that people thrive on change and they thrive on new challenges. And if you put yourself on an incredibly narrow track, I think sometimes that comes at a cost. When I used to be in a full-time member of an orchestra, I was happy to be able to say that I was. I guess there's a certain cachet. It was a quite a senior job and in a very well regarded orchestra. But at the same time, they owned me every hour of the day. I felt like basically I was never home. I was always working, always touring. And B, while it was a musical job, I can't say it's a creative job. I would say
Right.
I would say it's a heavily skilled job, but it's a very narrow set of skills and a very narrow set of skills that are incredibly important to have as a musician. But we're all trained to do so much more and use our brains. And I didn't feel like, as a full time member of an orchestra, I was using my brain. And actually, I then found that I didn't enjoy what I did. I felt like it was steadily squeezing the fun out. And the aim in choosing your passion to be the main thing you do is not really about earning an income. It's about doing something that gives you pleasure and doing it a lot. But if it doesn't give you pleasure, then I kind of felt like, well, I may as well be doing any job.
That's what I was just wondering. Is it like just, sitting at a desk and just doing the technical
Well,
work
that's
and
that's a little bit the way I came to think of it. And I
hmm.
think probably looking from the outside, people would find that odd because you go out on stage and they clap for you and there's all of the pomp and circumstance and you play in these beautiful halls and you tour and so on. But when you do the same thing over and over and over, and when you don't feel in charge of your life, and when you don't feel you're improving yourself or learning new things, um, then it starts to feel like a treadmill. And as I say, I don't think it was a creative activity. A lot of talented young players I've given lessons to. To be honest, I rarely push people to become professionals unless they're very, very driven to. Because I don't think paying the rent from what you do gives it any extra magic. If you have a job, and I know several people like this, if you have a job which gives you the freedom to also uh, do your music very well or whatever your passion is, I think that's no less valid an activity. I think that's no less a goal to aspire to. So being professional in itself, I don't think is necessarily the only target.
Right, that makes sense because I could see you are it sounds like you're producing, what the other composer has created and being a part of that musical team, but on your other side, you're composing film music. So you are able to use the creativity to produce your own thing instead of performing somebody else's work. That kind of sounds like what it would be. Am I right? I don't know.
Orchestral playing is a very specific thing. You're expected to play very expressively and very musically, and to a degree, it's. I suppose there's a small amount of creativity involved, but actually, the big musical decisions are by definition the job of the conductor. It's the conductor who's playing this instrument of which you are a part.
Oh, right, as the whole, right.
Yeah. So you are a small part of this big and beautiful thing, and it is a beautiful thing. It's just that I felt like being part of that big thing is it's part of what a musician should do, but it's not everything. All of us are complete human beings. And personally, I needed to feel that I also had to use my brain and make musical decisions. And so and that doesn't necessarily mean you have to compose film scores or compose anything else. You could just play a piece of music by yourself or in a quartet or in a smaller group where you actually have to engage. And although you are playing what a composer wrote, it is very much a creative activity in that you are understanding what's written in front of you. It's being filtered through your own personal experience and your logic, and you're creating something that wasn't there before. And you're making decisions about how you understand a composer's intention. So for me, I guess it's a more satisfying kind of activity, playing in a smaller way outside of an orchestra. And I think there's different kinds of creativity as well. I think there's creativity where you start with a blank sheet of paper and you say, I'm going to make something here that tell a story, build something that no one doesn't exist yet, no one's seen before. I think then there's a more reactive kind of creativity, which I think is largely what I'm more involved in, which is where you start with someone's inspiration, the kernel of something, and it sparks something in you. And together you make something hopefully even greater. And you might steer it in different directions. And it might go back and forth in complex ways. And that goes for playing groups or it goes for writing for films. Because for composing for films, you are very much reacting to this concept from the writer, the concept from the director, and you're given license to use your imagination to take it in a particular direction. You're not starting from a blank sheet of paper, and you have a very clear responsibility to stay within to stay within the lines. But it's no less creative, even though you're standing on the shoulders of somebody else.
Right, I could see it, as writing a story off of a painting. You're seeing something that you can run with. And I find that really fascinating with the musical side, feeling an emotion from the movie or a scene and then imagining what that sounds like is very dreamlike and amazing. Do you get to see the film at all or pieces of it, or is it all from the script?
It's usually from the film. I mean, people have different ways of working, but generally, you turn up when the editing has been done. It's quite late in the process, and you're presented with what looks like a largely finished film, except without special effects, and you work from that. Often, the editor has laid down what's called a temp score, which is bits of music that the editor or the director thinks work with a scene. And then your task is to replace that. But sometimes there's no temp score. Sometimes it's a blank slate altogether. And the first thing is going through with the director and deciding where there should be music and where there shouldn't be music. And that in itself is quite a crucial and creative set of decisions.
Right. What was your favorite film to compose?
That's really difficult to answer.
It's like each one is a special thing.
I think it's always great when you feel like you have the faith of a director, when you feel like there's real trust there. And also just to be clear, when it comes to scoring films, I always score as a duo with my French co-composer Oleg Spies. So we work as a team together. But what is special is when a director can say to you, go do what you think is right. You have a fairly blank slate music wise because they trust you. And that always feels good. I think it usually gets the best result.
The open creative freedom, I think
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
might help a little. Right.
I
Wow.
think I think managing creativity is another interesting set of skills. Like when you're a director, you have a whole set of people under you who are full of ideas, but ultimately you have a specific vision. So then it's, where do you draw the line between micromanaging everyone and letting people run with their ideas? Uh, which is why I suppose a lot of directors keep a very similar team around them for their whole career, because you get a set of people that you really trust. But it's interesting, and it's really complex. And that's one of the beautiful things about film. Although it's so much bigger than you are, in the way that playing an orchestra is so much bigger than you are, the position you have as a composer, from my point of view, it's critical, it's incredibly privileged, and it influences so heavily the way an audience understand a film. So, yeah, I think it's a position of a lot of responsibility and incredibly exciting. I think whenever a director or producer invites you on board their project, I mean, that project exists because many stars have aligned. It's probably been someone's dream to get that film made for more years than you'd believe. And so if someone invites you on their film project, I don't think I'd ever be blasé about that.
Right. Working with someone, you're having to work with so many people as a team, a creative team to, like you were saying, trust and rely on them, and let them into that circle to create something that's years, decades in the making, like you said,
Yes.
is a privilege. And there's that trust factor to rely on them. And So you have led other bands. You led the Hamilton production in London. Is that correct? And how is that different? Yeah, how is that different than your own pieces?
My job in the Hamilton band is first violin, and or they call it an orchestra there. There's 9 of us. I've been doing it a while now, and it's again, I feel very lucky because Hamilton means a lot to a lot of people. We still get people coming in who'll sit in the front row, and at the end of the first number, they will scream like they're being murdered. And it's because they have this incredible visceral excitement of being there in the room where it happens, if you like. And so to turn up and have that kind of energy is pretty special. Although actually, in the band, we are enclosed under the stage. So we don't have any, I mean, I can't see the audience, can hear them.
Okay.
It's a lovely band. As I say, there's 9 musicians plus an MD. The MD is the person who conducts and also plays a bit of keyboard. It's quite minimal. So it's a string quartet plus a keyboard plus guitar and bass, percussion and drums. And the nice thing about that show, the man who orchestrated the music is called Alex Lacamoire. I'm sure many people will know his name. And I love his approach to what he does. So basically, as a player in a band, his kind of writing makes you feel valued. There's a kind of a slightly unhealthy trend, I think, in musicals these days, where they pretend there's an orchestra and there isn't one. The way it's done is you'll have a synthesizer playing kind of orchestral sounds, like string sounds, and then you'll have a handful, like 3, 4 live orchestral musicians playing along with that. And so the effect is you get a kind of a synthesizer-y kind of orchestral sound with a touch of a human sound layered on it. And it sounds like you've got, a theater full of orchestra players, kind of,
Okay.
with a touch of sort of, it sounds a little bit fake and stuff, but you can sort of get by. To me, it's a bit like having a cut price orchestra.
Okay.
That's the opposite of what Alex Lacamoire does. Alex Lacamoire says, okay, we have these resources in the pit. We have 4 string players. We've got 1 drum kit, 1 percussionist, 1 keyboard, guitar and bass. How do we squeeze the most exciting stuff out of those instruments? So we don't pretend there's something else. We don't pretend there's like 100 players down there and it's a score from the 50s or whatever. Rather than pretending we have something else, how do we use these small forces as our strength?
Right. Incorporating that and being creative with the limitations without forcing something else to it, I think.
Exactly. How to be creative with the limitation. And that's what he does beautifully. I think when he writes the, the stuff for strings, which is what I play, it could only be on like a single string. Speaking abstractly about it is a little bit difficult because I think giving you concrete examples would kind of be easier. My point is, he made the limitations a virtue. And I think that's such a wonderful thing to do in so many of, creative activities when you feel like, oh, if only I had unlimited money, or if only I had unlimited space or unlimited people involved, then you think, well, actually, what do I have? And how can I squeeze out the absolute best from what I have and make something that would be very hard to do with actually, you'd never do with unlimited resources, but could be much more special.
Absolutely. That's mind blowing to me a little bit because, thinking, oh, if we had more, if we had this, if we, but sometimes that might be overwhelming, overloading. And to work with something more limited can often produce something beautiful and more beautiful and unique with that limitation.
Absolutely.
And
I think we thrive within limitation. I think the problem with computers as artists, musicians, any kind of creatives, you've now got an almost unlimited palette in front of you when you sit down to do something. You can do anything. You can draw on art, music in any time in history. As an electronic musician, you can make almost any sound. Where do you start? It's
Right.
terrifying. It's like an abyss. But if you look at the music of Bach, say, it exists within very strict parameters, uses very limited number of instruments, maybe one, follows a set of patterns over and over again. But within those very strict parameters, manages to do something kind of miraculous. Because I think that our minds, once we set the parameters and say, okay, my project is going to exist within this space. So I'm in real terms, you might say, okay, I'm only going to use this kind of scale. I'm only going to use these two instruments. It's only these are my rules. It has to last 3 minutes long, and this is what I want it to do. Then I think it's a much easier problem to deal with.
That makes sense. And as I'm thinking here about different forms of creativity, and you were talking about, in a certain time period where they didn't have a lot of, the internet or the computer to pull from. I think a lot of times when I see children playing, they have limited resources with their toy, depending on, they're outside, they've got a stick, they've got a tree, and they're pulling from that, and they might make the most beautiful creative moment with that limitation. And that just made me think of that. But so when I'm thinking about being a child, so for you, were you always into, did you have the violin when you were really young, and this was just something you wanted to do? Or how did that work for you? And when did you start playing? And was that like a school activity
I
or?
started playing when I was very, very small. I was too small to really make the decision about starting playing or not. My parents are both school teachers, and they're both musical people, but they never did it professionally. I mean, my dad, he loves folk music. He loves classical music and introduced me to that. But I think probably even more, he loves folk music and bluegrass. He used to sing us songs with guitar. My parents both played the piano. I think they had real joy in that kind of home amateur music making, which you could argue is kind of the most pure, kind of ancient sort of music making there is, just singing to your family.
Yeah.
That's probably what people have been doing for much longer than they've been doing formal concerts or anything like that. Anyway, at the time, I think I could sing a couple of notes in tune, so they took me along to a panel, and in Canberra, where we used to live, and the panel looked at my tiny hands and raised an eyebrow, but they decided I should start group lessons, and that led to individual lessons. I don't know whether or not I was particularly interested in violin. I was very competitive, and I liked the idea of trying to be better than the other kids. And also, I was using this book called A Tune a Day, which was a very simple music learning resource textbook. And I remember turning the page, and on the next page was how to put the next finger down on the string. And you'd put the next finger down on the string, and it would make it on the note. And it was so much easier than I thought it should have been. And I felt like that was, I mean, when you're starting an instrument and you're only playing the open strings, there's only four notes you can play. And then you realize you can put the finger down, and that's a whole nother note. So you go from four to, well, you can do it on each string. So suddenly you've got double the number of notes. Incredibly exciting. You turn the page, you put down another finger, and suddenly there's 12 notes you can. The progress was intoxicating. Basically, it felt like incredibly easy self improvement. And there's nothing more exciting than learning stuff. There's nothing
Right.
more exciting than learning stuff. And I think that got me hooked. And once you learn stuff for long enough, and you start to feel you're good at something, it's an amazing thing. Learning a skill, any skill, because if you keep that skill in good nick, you have it. It's something incredibly personal that you have that belongs to you, and it's another part of you that didn't exist before. And on the violin, it's a sound. It's a very personal sound that I have that nobody else has. That yeah, that's mine. And the same goes for anybody else that does something, that plays an instrument, draws, sings, paints, doesn't matter. And improving is intoxicating because you have suddenly more freedom with this thing.
Hmm.
You can do something, and you can do some. You can play pieces you couldn't play before. You can play them better, and you start listening to players, and you realize how incredible it can be. Yeah, I found that tremendously exciting, and I think it's something which mystified probably a lot of the people I went to school with, because at that time in Australia, when I was growing up, I mean, it wasn't very cool for a guy at school to be playing violin. But I think it was the process of improvement that was continually intoxicating.
Right. Something in the brain is lighting up,
Yeah,
and connecting things and wanting to see what else it can do. And I think maybe the creative tie-in is what keeps it fueled and going and excited. Like you were saying, if you're doing the same thing over and over, that doesn't necessarily fuel it the same way as learning with it and growing with it.
it's the idea that suddenly it's like a computer game. You've unlocked a new stage.
Yeah, new level.
Yeah, achievement unlocked. I think everyone can relate to that kind of buzz. And the idea that something that was mysterious to you before, you figured out how to do. And then there's more you can see that you realize if you can do that, then probably you can do the next thing. My parents, since they retired, they went on a learning spree. I'm sure in the States that you've got similar kind of institutions, but in Australia, where my parents live, there's something called University of the Third Age, and they have that in the UK too, I think.
They can sit in on classes, they can take more classes
Yeah,
and learn and
basically the
yeah.
idea is that professionals who've retired from whatever they did, they can teach what they did.
Oh, they teach it then. Okay.
I mean, I didn't mean specifically my parents, although they do teach
Oh,
classes. For example, if you've been a civil engineer all your life, you could teach retired people. Once you retire, you can then teach a class on civil engineering, and those people who are fascinated with it can come and listen. And that's what my parents did after they retired. And honestly, I don't think I've ever seen them as happy as they are.
I could see that where they're gaining more because they want to. I mean, so many of us grow up, I'm having to take a class in high school or college, and college is a little less, but you're having to do something you don't want to do, but as soon as you choose it and it's interesting to you, then you thrive and you grow and you produce something creative, and I love that.
Yes, just the idea that somehow you are more than you were yesterday.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that was always the drive from being very small, playing the violin, to my retired parents learning Latin or square dancing or bird spotting and or the various things that they do.
That they have the freedom to go explore like we did as children. We had more freedom to pick something up and play with it, and they get that now. And maybe for a lot of us it's something that we could just try and not feel as we're busy in our working lives, but to feel like we could pick something up and try it and not feel like it's it's something we had to do, a project, but it's something for us.
Now we're confronted with many tools that are kind of an impediment to learning a skill. Chat GPT, just as an example,
Right.
sort of the AI facilities that will make a picture for you, or write a story for you, or write music for you. All activities that required a certain level of skill and kind of engagement. There's an idea now that a computer can step in at press of a button and do that for you. I don't hate that that exists. I think it has its place, but in my experience, I don't think there's anything quite as fulfilling as acquiring skills yourself, actually making something that wasn't there before and doing it with your hands and feeling that from beginning to end, it was you. I feel like that we have a primal need for that.
Yes.
And the idea that you press a button and something comes out, a story comes out, or a picture comes out, it rings hollow.
Right. It's lifeless.
But it means that you're slightly at the mercy of that kind of machine. You've got to accept the story that comes out. You don't know how it happened. You give your set of instructions, and then it writes it for you. As a violinist, the level of control you have over the music that comes out is as complete as your skill is. And it's satisfying. It's a very pleasurable thing. And I feel like pressing a button and making something come out denies uh,
Right.
a kind of a certain pleasure that comes from doing something difficult.
I think, yeah, it sounds like a cheating yourself out of something that you could have grown from and gained and
Yeah.
enjoyed. Cheating yourself from joy.
Yeah. I think, because honestly, as you know incredibly well, I'm sure, it's about the growing, it's about the satisfaction of improvement and stuff.
Through the pain, through the headache, through the challenges, and that is, going through all that and getting those notes down, or getting that visual down is the satisfaction, then is the reward. And I feel like yeah, you're just taking that away from the creative if you do it that way. And
Yes.
that's very true. So when you were going through your violin education and learning, did that just kind of evolve into, this is now what I am based on the skills that I have, or was it a choice later on that I'm going to go this direction, or did you have anything else that you were really wanting to do as well and you kind of just had to choose?
As a kid, I started to idolize certain violin players, people that I think probably most of my friends at school had never heard of. They became my sort of pin-up boys.
Hmm.
So I did feel a certain separation between myself and other kids who were more interested in football and stuff. That was fine. I was a bit of a loner anyway, and fairly bloody minded, and I quite liked the idea that this was my thing. But anyway,
Right.
so I kind of decided I wanted to be I wanted to be like my hero violinists. It didn't take many years to pass for me to be very, very set on that goal. And I was absolutely uh, single-mindedly driven to become that. And I came from a small city in country Victoria, about 2 hours north of Melbourne, called Bendigo, which is a lovely place, bigger than it used to be. Um, anyway, so I left there. I went to Melbourne, which was the big city, to study. I still felt like I needed to be on the other side of the world. At the time, I felt like music was on the other side of the world. And so as soon as I could put the money together and get sponsorship and stuff, I did and left for the UK. So yeah, I was very, very driven to play the violin and do nothing else. And that's how it was for really quite a long time, right through my college years. And it was quite a bit later, in my late 20s, that the idea of doing anything else at all came along. And I'm glad it did, because I think that, as I say, people are complex and we need different challenges, and they're mutually beneficial as well. For example, I found that the composing work that I've done helps a lot the way I think about the playing work that I do, and vice versa. I feel like they're sort of complementary activities.
I could see that. But I am just blown away by how you see things differently than you did, and how you can take what you've learned and you're doing it in a different way, for seems like for more of yourself, for your own creative good, your own creative outlet. It isn't often we get to hear the experiences of someone in your field. It seems so niche and, confined maybe to its own thing. And I'm just very privileged that you were able to come and share with us all about the nuances and insights about how we think we should be creative and how what can limit us and what can't. So anyway, I'd love to know for our listeners where people can find you online, and I will also put this in the show notes. But if you have a website or a handle.
I think the best site is patricksavage.com. And
Yeah.
then there's a link tree there that takes you to everything else.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I would love, like I said, to just keep listening and add more, and just, I'm kind of enthralled by all the things that you've done and where you've taken it. I think is the most interesting part for me is what you're doing with it for you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's a rare opportunity to talk about these things, and I'm incredibly grateful that you're interested. And the subject of creativity is fascinating. In my mind, people aren't divided up into creatives and non-creatives. I think we are all creatives. There's so many different ways that can be expressed, and it's a fascinating topic. And I'm very glad that your podcast exists.
Oh, thank you. For the listeners, we would love to hear any comments or your thoughts on creativity, and is there anything that limits you and what frees you from those limitations, or if there's something simple that has helped you. If you find this podcast valuable, you can share it with others. Then we can reach more people who might like a little bit of inspiration in their own creative journey. So with that, I will leave you until next time. I'm Becky Garish, and happy creating.
Hey there, creative minds! Are you ready for the next burst of inspiration? Make sure to subscribe to the Origins of Creativity podcast in your favorite podcast app for all our latest episodes. Visit bookligmedia.com/podcast for show details, links to connect with us, and so much more. This has been the Origins of Creativity podcast, where inspiration meets imagination.